So today we'll continue and hopefully complete the overview of Kunti Maharani's prayers. So as we discussed in our earlier sessions, Kunti Maharani's prayers are the first prayers in the Bhagavatam, and they set the mood for what is going to come subsequently in the Bhagavatam. And in these prayers, she has till now talked about first the transcendental nature of the Lord, then she has talked about the inconceivable nature of His protection, then which is actually the heart of the prayers, and that is the theme which she will return back to now. Then she talks about the mysterious pastimes of the Lord, how He appears in various forms and performs pastimes. Then the fourth section talks about the various reasons why the Lord appears. And then the last section is a prayer to the Lord. My dear Lord, please protect me by staying in my heart, by giving me your remembrance. So initially when the prayer starts, it is like a request to Krishna, or at least that's what the context suggests. It's a request to Krishna. Krishna is about to depart, and Kunti Maharani is requesting Krishna, please stay on. But as the thoughts in the prayer progress, her heart's deep-rooted affection comes out, and she says, my dear Lord, whatever is your will, I accept it. But please, whether you stay with us or you go, please stay forever in my heart. So let's continue with our discussion. I hope you have the sheets. Okay. So we begin from the 39th verse. This is on your sheet. The last verse on the left column in the reverse page. So let's recite this. This is the 39th verse. Neyam shobhishyate tatra. So second, reverse side of the page, bottom left column. Neyam shobhishyate tatra. Neyam shobhishyate tatra. Yathe danim gadadhara. Danim gadadhara. Tvatpadairankita bhati. Dairankita bhati. Swalakshan vilakshitai. Swalakshan vilakshitai. So in the previous prayer, Kunti has said that, just as a body has no value without a soul's presence, similarly, our existence has no value without you. In this verse, she is continuing that theme, and now she is saying not only our life does not have value, even whatever we possess, our possessions, this kingdom we are ruling. So the Lord may say, now you have become the rulers of the world. So you have the world with you. Even if I am not there, what difference will it make? So the Lord, she replies over here, Neyam shobhishyate tatra. This will not be beautiful. It will not appeal to the heart. Yathe danim gadadhara. You who are gadadhara, you are. Now the significance of the names of the Lord has innumerable names, and the devotees use different names at different times. So here, Gadadhara, the Lord uses the mace to protect His devotees. So He says, you are our protector. Tvatpadair ankita bhati. So by the signs of your lotus feet, when Krishna places His feet, then the footmarks are created wherever He walks. Swalakshan vilakshitai. That is your own lakshana, your own sign. Vilakshitai. It is like very vilakshan, special sign is there. This land will no longer be ornamented by your lotus feet. So the gopis also pray in their Gopi Geet. Now in one sense, if we see in the Bhagavatam, there are not many prayers by females. There's the first canto, there is Kunti's prayer. Of course, Uttara offers just one brief prayer. Then there are prayers, no doubt. There is when Aditi is praying to Vamana, she offers prayers in the 8th canto. In the 10th canto, there are Nagapatni's prayers, then there are Brahman Patni's prayers, there are Gopis' prayers. Now, Draupadi also offers prayers to Krishna, especially when she is being disrobed. But those prayers are not explicitly mentioned in the Bhagavatam. They are referred to, that she just called out to Krishna. Now, among all these prayers, whether they are by males or females, the highest are considered to be by the Gopis. Now, in one sense, the context of the Gopis' prayers and Kunti's prayers is similar. Kunti is fearing separation, and the Gopis are experiencing separation. The theme is imminent separation from the Lord. And whenever there is separation, we know the Gopis offered prayers when Krishna called them for the Ras Leela, that is the 29th chapter. Then Krishna had some talks with them, that is described in 30th chapter of the 10th canto. And then after that Krishna disappears. And 31st chapter is the prayers of the Gopis. So Kavi Karanapur describes in Anandavan Champu that the Gopis search everywhere for Krishna. They go deep into Vraja forests. In fact, they go so deep that the forests are so thick at that place that even the moonlight cannot penetrate. And they feel we can't even see the ground in front of us. If we can't see that, how will we be able to search for Krishna? So, in utter dejection, they return back to the coast of the Jamuna. They think that we cannot see Krishna, but Krishna can see us. And they come to the coast of Jamuna because near the Jamuna, they have upon many pastimes of Krishna. And at least they can remember that. And there they assemble and there they call out to Krishna with their heart's longing. So Jiva Goswami in Gopal Champu has, based on the characteristics of each gopi, described. Now there are 19 prayers in the Gopi Gita. So each prayer, he says, is offered by one specific gopi. And he analyzes, based on the personalities of the gopis and the mood of the prayer, which prayer among these prayers is offered by which gopi. And further he describes that the prayers are offered. Now we have Shri Bhagavan Vaj. Bhagavan is speaking. Or Arjuna Vaj. Now there it is Shri Gopyaha Uchu. Gopyaha is plural. So now, is it that, sometimes when school children, they have to do some musical performance. So all of them memorize some song and all of them recite in a chorus. So when the Gopi Geet is offered, is it that all the gopis have memorized these verses earlier and they are doing a synchronous performance? Shri Gopyaha Uchu. No, they are not. So Jiva Goswami is offering Jiva Goswami explains that each prayer is offered by one gopi. So the Gopi Geet demonstrates individuality within unity. All the gopis are united in their love for Krishna. They are all agonized by separation from Krishna. So when each gopi is speaking a verse, offering a prayer, she is offering that prayer as a representative of the group. But while representing the group, she is representing the group by expressing her individual emotions. So, we are all united in our desire to serve Krishna. And the desire to serve Krishna is far more important than the desires to serve Krishna. What do I mean? The desire to serve Krishna is the broad principle. My life is meant for your service. Krishna, I want to serve you. The desires to serve Krishna refer to the different specific plans. Okay, I want to do this. Somebody else may want to do something else. Or the same thing, one person may want to do one way, another person may want to do different way. So these are the desires to serve Krishna. So sometimes, because different devotees have different desires to serve Krishna, that may create conflict. But over and beyond that conflict, we should see the commonality. The desire to serve Krishna itself is so rare and special and precious. So that if somebody has, that is far more important. So the gopis are individuals. They have their own heart. And with their heart, they are offering the prayer to Krishna. So when they are offering this prayer, so the gopis, we are discussing this Gopi Gita because there also the theme of the lotus feet comes. So the gopis actually talk about Krishna's lotus feet 3 times. So one prayer is offered directly remembering the lotus feet, the glory of the lotus feet. So the gopis say that Dharani mandanam dheyamapadi charana pankajam santamam chate ramanasthaneshva arpayadhihan. So the gopis pray that Dharani mandanam, Dharani is earth, mandanam, your lotus feet are the ornament of the earth. So, pranata kamadam padmajarchitam, that is the first line. They say that first, anyone who bows down to your lotus feet, that person's desires are fulfilled. And these lotus feet are worshipped by Brahmaji himself, padmajarchitam. And they are the monument, Dharani mandanam, of the earth. So all the Vrajavasis are very careful that where Krishna walks, where the lotus feet, the imprints are created, none of them walk over them, because they want the earth to be decorated by those lotus feet for as long as possible. And he says, Dheyamapadi. Apadi means danger, distress. So whenever there is danger and distress, your lotus feet are the object of meditation. When we meditate on your lotus feet, then those gives you nectar that Ashoka Bhayamrit Purna Sarvakhan. Bhaktivinoda Thakur says that your lotus feet are a reservoir of nectar. And we meditate on them, they free us from the anxiety. So here the gopis are praying, Charana Pankajam Santamam Chate. Those lotus feet, Ramanasthaneshva Arpayadihan. Please bestow the blessing of those lotus feet on us. So this is one reference. The 2 other references come when the gopis are saying, at these lotus feet, how fortunate was Kaliya that you offered the lotus feet to them, to him. Fani fanarpitam te padambujam. So Fani fanarpitam. Fani is the serpent which has a hood, that is Kaliya. Fana arpitam. So the gopis are devotionally re-envisioning the pastime. Rather than seeing that Krishna banged on Kaliya's hoods and subdued him, they are thinking that Krishna actually offered his lotus feet to them. Fani fanarpitam. And they are thinking that those lotus feet which were offered to Kaliya, he is so fortunate, why are we not getting those lotus feet? Now, the gopis, the mood of love is that love actually subordinates everything in the spiritual world. Reality is that which is anukul to prema, and everything else is subordinated. Now, for example, when Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu sees any river, especially when chapter 16, 17, 18 of the Madhya Leela describe how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu plans to go to Vrindavan. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu sets off to Vrindavan, and finally Chaitanya Mahaprabhu arrives in Vrindavan. So now there it is described when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was on his way, whenever he would see any river, so what did he see? What would he think of that river to be? Jamuna. Similarly, any hill? Govardhan. Any forest? Vrindavan. Now, if say Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is starting from Jagannath Puri and he is going through the Jharkhand forests. Now, if he sees the Jharkhand forest to be Vrindavan, now is that Vrindavan or is it not Vrindavan? It is Vrindavan. If it is Vrindavan, then why does Chaitanya Mahaprabhu have to go further from there to Vrindavan? He doesn't stop over there. He says, okay, this is Vrindavan, I'll be satisfied here. So, now if we say that it is not Vrindavan, if we say it is Vrindavan, then why does he go further? Leave that. If we say it is not Vrindavan, then is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu making a mistake? How can God make a mistake? God is perfect. The point is, in the spiritual world, what is important is not factual reality as we understand it. What is important is that which is enhancing rasa, that which is favorable to relishing sweetness. So, from the devotional perspective, from the analytical perspective, we may say that, yes, this is not Vrindavan. And in one sense it's true, Jharkhand is not Vrindavan. But from the devotional perspective, the greatness is based on one's absorption in Krishna, one's capacity to connect everything with Krishna. And so what is emphasized is that a devotee is able to remember Krishna everywhere. Now Krishna is God. So for Yashoda Mai to think that if I don't feed Krishna, Krishna will die. Krishna will starve, Krishna will become weak. Now that is completely, we could say, absurd. God, nothing is going to happen to God. Om Purnamada Purnamidam. He is perfect and complete. He doesn't need anything or anyone else. But, so when Yashoda Mai has such a feeling that without my taking care, Krishna will not live, that is not considered a dushana. It is a bhushana. It is not a distortion, it is a decoration. It is not an incorrect understanding. So always we have to understand, when we come to the bhakti platform, we cannot approach it with the analytical perspective. We have to approach things with the aesthetic perspective. Now, for example, if somebody is a beautiful rose flower, is there? Now, if somebody decides to see the rose flower from a botanical perspective, you can see, okay, there is this androecium, there is this gynoecium, there is this carpels, there is this stamen. And now, that is also a correct perspective. But with the botanical perspective, one cannot relish the beauty of the lotus. Whereas, when one wants to relish it from an aesthetic perspective, at that time, the fact is there, okay, it has all these parts, androecium, gynoecium, all that, but that is not the emphasis. Oh, how beautiful it is, how fragrant it is, how attractively shaped it is. So, when analysis is to be done, often emotions are the roadblock. Whereas, when aesthetics are to be appreciated, emotions are the road. Emotions are the road. And if I want to appreciate the beauty of a lotus, without emotions, I will not be able to appreciate it. Similarly, when we approach Krishna, if we approach only from an analytical perspective, then in the analytical perspective, one has to de-emotionalize oneself. Put aside the emotions, be objective, be critical. That is good for analyzing philosophy. So emotions come in the way when we talk about the path of jnana. And that's why in Jnana Marga, cut down the emotions, put away the emotions. But in bhakti, emotions are the way. So when we say that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is talking about seeing every forest as Vrindavan, he is seeing from the emotional perspective. And that, from the rasa perspective, is the highest reality. So same way here, the gopis are knowing, and they are telling also that Krishna, he put his feet on the hoods of the poisonous Kalia. And in the same sequence of prayers, the gopis say, Krishna, you are walking in the forest and your feet are being touched they are being pierced. Shilatrunankurai Sidati tina Kalilatam manaha kanta gacchati. They're saying that Shilatrunankurai, that there are pebbles, there are twigs, there are thorns, and they're piercing your feet. And when they're piercing your feet, actually that thought is piercing our hearts. Not only piercing our hearts, it is ripping apart our hearts. We cannot tolerate it. The gopis pray, Krishna, that you are separated from us, that causes agony for us. But the thought that your lotus feet are being pierced by thorns, that causes even greater agony. So even if you don't want to come to relieve us of the agony of separation, at least come, because we cannot tolerate the thought that your tender lotus feet are being pierced by the thorns. So now, if we compare Kaliya's venomous fangs. Where are his fangs and where are some thorns? Thorns are insignificant compared to the deadly fangs of Kaliya. And Krishna has pounded with his feet that very Kaliya who had such terrible fangs. And the gopis know that. So if Krishna can overcome Kaliya with his terrible fangs, what are thorns for Krishna? What are thorns for those same lotus feet? But when the gopis' heart is filled with love, they are re-envisioning everything from the perspective of love. And similarly here Kunti Maharani, she is re-envisioning everything from the perspective of love. She is not thinking, now Yudhishthira has become the emperor of the world. Now the whole world's wealth will be at his command. She is thinking, my dear, or if your lotus feet are not ornamenting our kingdom, then what is the use of this kingdom? What is the use of the things of this world if they do not give us the opportunity to serve Krishna? They do not invoke the thoughts of Krishna, the remembrance of Krishna, and ultimately the presence of Krishna. So now she talks about the same theme first in the negative way. Oh, this land will not be decorated. And then the next word she says, because you have graced this land, so what happens? How this land is abundantly prosperous. She talks about in the next verse. So, ime janapada spriddha supakvaushadhi virudaha aushadhi viruddha vanadrinadyaudanvanto dyaudanvanto yadhante tava vikshitahi. So, tava vikshitahi, your glance. Iksha is glance. It's connected with eyes. Tava vikshitahi. Because you have glanced, because you have bestowed mercy, ime jana padaha. The places where jana reside, people reside, that is the cities. Supakvaushadhi viruddha. So, there are herbs, there are trees, there are forests, and there are rivers, and they are all filled to the point of flourishing with prosperity. And why is all this? Because of your mercy. Now, one of the defining characteristics of the modern age is the divorce of nature from the Lord of nature. In modern society, if we see, historically, whether it was India or whether it was the West, it was understood that nature is far more subtler and complex than what we can understand. And that's why people knew that we have to live in harmony with nature. We have to live in harmony with nature. Nature has formidable powers and forces, and we cannot antagonize them. So, when Dutta Karma Prabhu and Mukunda Maharaj, they have written a book called Divine Nature, where they talk about the spiritual roots of the environmental crisis. So basically, if we see, this idea of living in harmony with nature was there for millennia. But from the 16th century onwards, when science started understanding the workings of nature, and the confidence of scientists increased, and they started thinking that now we can control nature. Actually, it is more that not just the confidence of scientists increased, the percentage of the atheists increased, and atheists started taking over science. Now, sometimes people think there is a conflict between science and religion. I have to choose, or if I believe in God, then I am not being scientific. But the conflict is not between science and religion. The conflict is between materialism and spirituality. And unfortunately, in today's society, science has been hijacked by materialists, especially by atheistic materialists. I'll explain what this means as I return to the historical narrative. So basically, say, Newton observed that, okay, these planets are moving and the earth, on the earth also objects move. How do they move? They move by the laws of nature. And we can give a mathematical expression for them. And then we can replicate that. The whole science of mechanics was based on that. That we can observe and simulate what happens in nature through our mechanical contraptions. And then the idea was we will be able to control more and more of nature. So the vision earlier was of cooperation with nature, but then we thought we can control nature. Why? Because now we have science and technology. And through technology we will be able to control nature and we will be able to conquer nature eventually. So initially, whereas the vision of nature was that of a mother. Now there are Western thinkers like Francis Bacon, and subsequently they said, actually nature is not a mother. Nature is a stepmother. Why a stepmother? There are always stories in folklore all over the world about how the stepmother is cruel to some tender child. So that nature causes storms, nature causes calamities, there are earthquakes. And all this is indicating that nature is cruel. If somebody is so cruel, a mother cannot be so cruel. So nature must be a stepmother. So this famous British poet, nature is red in tooth and claw. So red in tooth and claw is just like a animal comes and kills, and blood is there in tooth and claw. That's how this famous European poet said, nature is red in tooth and claw. Actually, nature is very cruel. And then subsequently, another philosopher of science, another atheist who also had philosophical pretensions, he said, actually, nature is no mother at all. She is just a fickle lady. Fickle woman, she's a whore. And the only way we can be controlled is by power. So, by increasing the power of science, we must control and conquer nature. And that is the only way humanity will be able to be happy. So the whole attitude towards nature changed from cooperation to conquest. And to some extent, humanity seemed to be succeeding. We seem to be doing many things which our ancestors were not able to do. And this, for example, say, we had developed machines by which we cut down forests, and we could say reclaim the land from the ocean, from the sea, and many things which we were able to do which in the past people were not able to do, which gave the idea that we are controlling nature. But the fact is that nature is not meant to be controlled by us. And now the scale of environmental problems that are coming up is far greater than ever before in history. And the problems are not small problems like one storm coming here or one earthquake happening there. The problems which are now going to come up are systemic. That means they are endemic within nature itself. The kind of environmental destabilization that is there. Now, 1 out of every 6 rivers in the world does not reach the ocean. 1 out of every 6 rivers. So much destabilization of natural resources has been done. And huge areas of the earth have been defertilized. They have become arid because of excessive exploitation. So huge tracts of land which were earlier flourishing, they have become completely arid. And we cannot envision the cataclysms that can happen when nature exhibits its prowess. For a long time, many historians thought that the whole Saraswati river is a mythology. Because we have Ganga, we have Jamuna, but there is no evidence of any river called Saraswati. So they thought it was a mythology. But then subsequently, and it has been found, American space satellites using their sensors, they can observe the surface below the earth also. They found in Rajasthan, where there is a Thar desert now, there are below the Thar desert, there are the remnants of an extremely broad river. In fact, that river is so broad that it would, basically, when a river flows, the river bed that is formed below the water, the soil composition of the river bed is different from the soil that is there on the normal surface that is exposed to the sun. So by observing the soil composition, it can be made, geologists can make out whether there was a river here or it was always dry land. So they have found it is such a broad river. So Rig Veda describes how Saraswati has a majestic scope, and more or less the pathway that has been described is also similar. Now significantly, not some excavations have been done, but not much, because unfortunately that whole tract of land is on the Indo-Pak border. And although a huge dam was also found over there, one of the biggest dams in world history, but it is right near the border, and so the Indian government doesn't allow much research to be done over there, and a significant part of it is in Pakistan also. And Pakistan doesn't want to support any research which will point to the glory of the Vedic culture of India. So the whole, because of politics, that research into the glory of Indian history is being stymied right now. But whatever has been found itself is profuse evidence that the Saraswati river was actually a historical river. And this river was so broad that eventually, as the river started drying up, there are evidences of houses on the riverbed also. That means if the river was this big, the houses were on the coast. The river started thinning, then the houses came on what was the riverbed earlier. And then around the time, 324 is the time when roughly Alexander came to India, 324 BC. So Alexander had brought a historian with him. And this historian, in his accounts, has written that when they came along, they found villages and towns which had been completely deserted. And why? We found that just the river Saraswati, it had just changed course. And when it changed course, all the areas which were irrigated previously by it got completely dried up. And the river, as it changed course, it went in a different direction. Then it dried up in that direction also. So the Saraswati river disappeared in itself. So what was a flourishing civilization from the cosmic time scale perspective in just a second? It happened over several hundred years. But as compared to millennia, over a few hundred years, what was a flourishing civilization became a desert wasteland. So what is the Thar desert now in Rajasthan and that area? That was the area where Saraswati was flowing. So I'm giving this as an example to illustrate that no matter how powerful humans become, we cannot control nature. Nature can unleash such forces and such changes that humans will be left powerless in front of it. Whole civilizations can be just wiped out in a very short time. So we depend ultimately on the mercy of God. Now, from an atheistic perspective, it may seem that, nature is just acting in arbitrary ways. Sometimes some storm comes over here, sometimes some earthquake happens over there. But we understand, ultimately it is under the supervision of the Lord. It is by the law of karma that these things happen. So, generally it is described that whenever the yugas change, just as there is a pralaya when Brahmaji sleeps at night, so there are smaller cataclysms that happen at every transition phase. So at every transition phase, so one transition phase is the change of yugas. So when Kali Yuga starts, what happens is that all the visible planets, along with the sun and the moon, they align in a single line. Now from a historical perspective, the sun, the moon, then starting from Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, all of them to be aligned in a single line. It's an extremely rare event. And now using computer technology, using knowledge of the sky, scientists can find out when was this event happened. So the Puranas describe that at the time of Kali Yuga, all these planets will align in one line. And the most recent time that this has happened is around 3038 BC. It's around 5,000 years ago. So what the scriptures say about 5,000 years ago Kali Yuga, that is true. But the point is that at the transition of one yuga to another yuga, so huge cataclysms also happen. And that's how the glory of Vedic civilization which was there, that is not so much perceivable through the historical record which we have. Of course, even the history that we have right now tells that India was a very prosperous country, but not as prosperous as the Vedic literature describes. That's because of the cataclysms that happen at the transition from one yuga to another yuga. Now moving forward, what Kunti is saying over here is that all this flourishing is there because you are casting your glance. Now the focus is shifting. Your merciful glance, she's saying that is the cause of our prosperity. So now her mood will change and she will say, my dear Lord, even if you are not here, even your lotus feet will not be here, let your glance be on us. Let your mercy be on us. And as her prayers request shifts, then she remembers. She's remembering that Krishna, you are present everywhere and you are related to us as well as to the Yadus. So let's recite the next verse. Atha Vishvesha Vishvatman Vishvesha Vishvatman Vishvamurte Svakeshu Me Vishvamurte Svakeshu Me Sneha Pashamimam Chindhi Pashamimam Chindhi Dridham Pandushu Vrishnishu Pandushu Vrishnishu Atha Vishvesh Vishvatman. So here there is alliteration. The same word Vishva is used 3 times. Alliteration is a figure of speech, is alankar that is used to decorate poetry. So Vishvesha Vishvatman Vishvamurte. The Vishva word is used 3 times. And Vishvesha, you are the Lord of the Vishwa. Vishvatman, you are the soul of the Vishwa. And Vishvamurte, you are the form of the Vishwa also. Om Vishvam Vishnur Vishatkaro Bhuta Bhavya Bhavat Prabho Bhuta Krit Bhuta Brit Bhavo Bhutatma Bhuta Bhavana. So right at the start of the Vishnu Sahasranam, the first set of names of Vishnu are also connected with Vishwa. So Om Vishwam Vishnur Vishatkaro. You are the Vishwa. You are the universe itself. Now here Kunti Maharani is talking something similar over here. So first she says Atha Vishvesha. You are the controller of the Vishwa, which is, we know God is the controller of everything, so you are the controller of the Vishwa. Atha Vishvesh Vishvatman. Vishvatman. Vishvatman means you are the soul, the Atma of the Vishwa. Now what does this mean? Actually, this Vishvatman concept is the defining metaphor of the Sri Sampradaya. Every Sampradaya has its philosophy. Even the Vaishnava Sampradayas have slightly different philosophies. And the philosophy is enshrined, encapsulated, summarized in a defining metaphor. So the defining metaphor of the Sri Sampradaya is the body and the soul. That Vishnu is like the soul and the whole of existence with the Chetan and the Achetan is like the body. So the defining metaphor of the Gaudiya Sampradaya is the sun and its energies. The energetic source and the energy. So the energy is at one place, the energetic source at one place, the energy is dissipated. Same way here, Vishvatman, that Krishna, you are the soul and of this universe. Now from a point of view of ontology means the nature of existence. From the point of view of existence, we know that when the universe is created, at that time, Garbhodaksha Vishnu enters into the universe. And Shirodaksha Vishnu enters into each atom. So it is said that Mahavishnu is the soul of the whole Mahatattva, of the whole material existence. Mahavishnu is the soul of the whole material existence. Garbhodaksha Vishnu is the soul of each universe. He enters into each universe. And then Shirodaksha Vishnu is the soul of each atom. Is the soul in each per individual also. So in this way, the various manifestations of Vishnu are the Atma, Vishvatman. And Vishvamurte. Vishvamurte, you are the form of the universe. Now, the form of the universe is talked about twice. There is the Vishwarupa, which is talked about in the Bhagavad Gita, 11th chapter is Vishwarupa Dharishan. And then there is a Virata Rupa, which is talked about in the second canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And that is referred to repeatedly in the Bhagavatam in the prayers. Now, are the two the same? The Vishwarupa of the Bhagavad Gita and the Virat Rupa of the Bhagavatam? At one level, they are similar in the sense that both are talking about seeing God in nature. in the universe, seeing the universe as a form of God. But there is a fundamental difference. The Bhagavad Gita's Vishwarupa is a revelation, whereas the Bhagavatam's Virat Rupa is a conceptualization. What is the difference? Revelation and conceptualization. Revelation means that Arjuna requests, Manyase yadi tad shakyam, if it is possible, my dear Lord, please show it to me. And then Krishna says, Divyam dadami te chakshu, pashyame, I give you the divine eyes, see. So Krishna is revealing that form. So that is a mercy of Krishna by which the revelation takes place. So revelation is top down. So Krishna gives that revelation. And Krishna does not give that revelation to everyone. So although that Vishwarupa is shown to Arjuna, nobody else on the battlefield saw the Vishwarupa. They did not see there. Now obviously Duryodhana did not see that. He was entering into the mouth of Duryodhana and on the Vishwarupa and is getting destroyed. So the revelation is selective. It is given to people whom the Lord graces. Now on the other hand, in the Bhagavatam, the Virat Rupa that is talked about is a conceptualization. Conceptualization means the Bhagavatam itself says Itti Manishina Kalpitaha. Kalpitaha. Kalpita means imagined. So there is no form of the Lord where the eyes are the sun and the moon, the upper planetary systems are the head, the lower planetary systems are legs. We have the 14 planetary systems. It's not apart from that there is some form which is existing, hanging in space or something like that. No, it's a conceptualization. It is an exercise which is to be done to connect the material world, matter, with God. So for those whose idea of greatness is locked with physical greatness. So if they want God is great, how great is He? He must be great in terms of physical dimensions. So for those people, this particular Vishwarupa is described. That this Lord, you want to know how great He is? The mountains are His bones. The trees are the hair on His body. So like that, the conceptualization is done. So it is a sadhana, and it is described, Sridhar Swami in his Bhavartha Deepika commentary describes that just like the yogis meditate on the yogis may meditate on different things. Initially, Bhruvor Madhye Pranamaveshya Samyak. The Bhagavad Gita describes two kinds of meditation, or two focuses for meditation. In 5.28 it says that Bhruvor Madhye, that focus on the portion in the middle of the eyebrows. And in the 6th chapter, the 13th verse, Krishna says, Samprekshanasika Gramswam, focus on the tip of the nose. So now, basically it's describing Ashtanga Yoga. One place it says focus on the place between the eyebrows, another it says focus on the tip of the nose. Why the difference? The point is, these are not important. These are just starting point. Initially when we start meditation, then we start with some external point of focus, and then by that we draw the consciousness inwards. The consciousness running here and there, take some point, focus on it, and using that starting focus, then turn the consciousness inwards. And then Krishna says that afterwards you fix your mind on me. My sanyamya machitto yukta sita matparaha. So in 6.15 he says, 6.13 he says, Samprekshanasika gramsam, fix on the nose tip, but then he says, fix the mind on me. So just as Sridhar Swami explains, that just as in the normal process of Ashtanga Yoga, the yogis have some external focus, and beginning from that external focus, they move on and then focus on the Lord in the heart. Similarly, in the Vishwarupa Upasana, in the form of worship which is done through the Vishwarupa, initially the focus is on the Vishwarupa. But after that, as the yogi matures and the focus shifts from the Vishwarupa inwards to Vishnu. So then there is no need for this meditation Vishwarupa. So the Vishwarupa is a tool for meditation, and it's a transitional tool. It's not permanently required. So Vishwamurte, you are the form of the universe. The yogis who meditate on the Vishwarupa, they meditate actually on you. So why is the word Vishwa used so many times over here? Vishvesha, Vishvatman, Vishvamurte. Because Krishna, you are everywhere. Svakeshu me. There are two manifestations of God. One is transcendent and the other is immanent. We use Krishna is transcendental. Transcendental means to be beyond this world. Yes, Krishna has his abode in the spiritual world. Parastasmat bhavo anyo. In 8.20 in the Gita, Krishna says that spiritual world is far beyond this world. So that is true. Krishna is beyond this world. But Krishna is not only beyond this world. Krishna is in this world also. Rasoham apshu kaunteya prabhashmi sasi suryayo. I says, I am the taste of water. I am the light of sun and moon. So what does he say? Krishna is present here also in this world. So in this way, Krishna is present everywhere. So she is saying you are present in this world also. This aspect of Krishna who is present in the world is called immanent aspect. So now, sneha pasham imam chindhi. The sneha pash, the bond of attachment that is there, chindhi, cut it off. And to whom? Sneha pasham imam chindhi drudham pandushu vrishnishu. To the Pandus, which is Pandus are her own sons. And Vrishnishu, she is related to the Vrishnis also. So please cut off the bond of attachment. So she is thinking that if I ask that the Krishna stay here, then the Yadus will be deprived of Krishna's association. And I can't have that. And at the same time, I can't let the Pandus and myself lose the association also. What should I do? Please, Krishna, let my decision not be based on my personal attachments. Let my decision be based on simply the desire to please you. So please cut off my attachments. So now Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he envisions that Krishna is asking a question here. He says, so if you don't want, I am always with my devotees. So if you say that you don't want to be attached to my devotees, then do you want to go to Brahman? Because I am never separate from my devotees. I am always with my devotees. You are saying that you don't want to be attached to the Vrishnis, you don't want to be attached to the Pandus. Then, if you want me without my devotees, then you will get Brahman. You will not get Bhagavan. So, Kunti Maharani replies, no, my dear Lord, I am offering the prayers to you. And you are Bhagavan, you are a person. I want to be attached only to you. But the attachment to the Pandus and Vrishnis as my relatives, which takes my consciousness away from you, please cut that off. So please cut off the attachment which takes my consciousness away from you. So that means when we have our relatives who are also devotees, then that attachment can also be devotional. That can help us move forward in our relationship with Krishna. So now she says, let nothing distract me from you. And that she talks about in the next verse now. Tvai me ananya vishaya, tvai me ananya vishaya, matir madhupate sakrit, madhupate sakrit, ratimudvahata dadha, mudvahata dadha, gange vaugham udanvati, vaugham udanvati. Gange Vaugham, just as the Ganga flows towards the ocean, oh Krishna, let my consciousness flow towards you. Ananya Vishaya. So let there be no Anya Vishaya. So if I remember the Pandus and Vrishnis and that reminds me of you, then that is not Anya Vishaya, that is you only. But if anything distracts me from remembrance of you, let there be no, my consciousness not go towards that. Ananya Vishaya, Matir Madhupate, consciousness, Madhupate, O Lord of Madhu, Asakrit. Now Madhu was also an ancestor in the Yadu dynasty. So Madhava is also one of his names. The word Madhava has around 11 meanings. So one of these is that descendant to the Madhu dynasty, Madhava. Madhava means Madhava. Dhava is to control. One who is never controlled by anyone. One who is the controller of everyone. So like that Madhava has many meanings. Here Madhupate. You are the Lord of our dynasty. Asakrit. Without any interruption. Let my consciousness go towards you. Now this metaphor of a river flowing towards the ocean. This is a favorite Mayavadi metaphor. They say that just as when the river flows into the ocean, then it merges in the ocean. So like that, when we reach into the absolute, impersonal absolute truth, then we will merge in it. And the Katha Upanishad also says like that. It uses, there is a verse in that. So the river flows to the ocean, and let the soul realize the absolute truth, like that. So now, significantly, although the same metaphor is used, the impersonalists and the personalists have a different focus. Kunti Maharani is using the same metaphor of a river flowing towards the ocean. But for the impersonalists, the focus is on merging. Whereas for the devotees, the focus is on flowing. So, just as the river flows towards the ocean, but neither the river ends nor the ocean ends. The river keeps forever flowing towards the ocean. So like that, we are eternal, Krishna is eternal, and our consciousness will eternally keep flowing towards the ocean. So the Mayavadis don't have a monopoly on this metaphor. It's just that when they give a particular twist to that metaphor, and they emphasize only the merging part, then it is wrong. Now the Vaishnava has no urge to merge. Vaishnava has no urge to merge. We just have a desire to serve eternally. And that's what Kunti Maharani is saying. And the same metaphor is used by Kapil Dev in his teachings also. So here Kunti is speaking from the point of view devotee. So Kapila speaks from the point of the Lord. He says, my pure devotees, their consciousness always flows towards me, just as the Ganga flows towards the river. Now Kapil Dev is not saying that my devotees merge in me. He says their consciousness always flows towards me. Now Vishwanath Chakravarti gives a very beautiful import of this verse. He says, why is Kunti using this metaphor of a river flowing towards the ocean? He says that actually, and so I have put that, the point which he says, I have put that as a chiasmus. Chiasmus is a figure of speech. It says a river, nothing holds a river back, and a river holds nothing back. Nothing holds a river back means if a river is flowing and if some rock is there, the river will go above, will go below, will go left from the left side, will go from the right side, or the river will erode the rock and go. So nothing holds the river back. And similarly, the river holds nothing back. That means when the river is flowing towards the ocean, the river doesn't think, oh, maybe I should keep 10% of my water with me only. I'll only send 90% of my water. No, the river sends all its water to the ocean. Similarly, Kunti uses this metaphor. Vishwanath Thakur says that, my dear Lord, let nothing hold my consciousness back. Let nothing, whatever external impediments come, somehow let my consciousness keep going towards Krishna. And so nothing holds a devotee back, and a devotee holds nothing back. When the devotee offers to Krishna, devotee offers everything to Krishna. Manasa deho geho, jo kichu amara, arpilu tuva pade, nanda kishore. So he starts with enlisting. Manasa deha geha. He says the mind, the body, the home. And then he says, okay, I have so many things in this world. What all list I will give? He says, jo kichu amara. Whatever is mine, all that I offer to you. So devotee holds nothing back. So Kunti Maharani is praying, let my consciousness flow completely towards you. Completely without any interruption. And this is the ultimate aspiration of every devotee. And with this prayer, Kunti Maharani, she has expressed her pure devotion in a very poignant way. Saying Krishna, she is not saying that Krishna, you stay here, you go there. Whatever you want, you do, my dear Lord. And I just let my consciousness flow towards you. And one of the ways in which consciousness flows towards Krishna is Vandanam. Sometimes when we offer prayers, we think, if I pray to Krishna and Krishna doesn't fulfill my prayers, then maybe my faith in Krishna will become weak. If I pray Krishna, I want to get good marks in the exam, or I want this or that. Sometimes some things are necessary or important even for our practice of devotional life. So we may feel, if I pray to Krishna for this, okay, let me get this kind of job, let me get this kind of spouse, let me get a house close to the devotee association, or whatever. There are so many things in this world which we need, and if we get them, we feel they will be anukul to our bhakti. So we can pray for this to Krishna. If we pray, sometimes we feel if Krishna doesn't give, then maybe my faith will decrease in Krishna. And because of that, we may hesitate to pray. But the Bhagavatam redefines prayer not so much with a focus on the result but on the process. That means when we see, if you see Brahma Samhita, it's a long series of prayers, and even if you see the full prayers, there's practically no request at the end. It's Govindam Adi Purusham Tamaham Bhajami. So when we see the 9 items of bhakti that are described, so Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnu, Smaranam Padasenam, Archanam, Vandanam Dasyam, Sakhyam Atma Nivedanam. So now when we hear about Krishna, when we speak about Krishna, what is the result that we get by that? Now what is the result of hearing or speaking? The result simply is that our relationship with Krishna develops. We come to know more about Krishna, our connection with Krishna develops more. So same way, the Bhagavatam says Vandanam is also like Shravanam, Kirtanam, Smaranam. The purpose of Vandanam is to develop our relationship with Krishna. So again, just as the Mayavadis, they focus on, when the river is flowing, they focus on the end. The river is merging. So like that, when materialists pray, their focus is on the end. Okay, I prayed this to Krishna, will Krishna give it or not? Will Krishna give it or not? The devotee's focus is not on the result. The devotee's focus is simply on the process. The process is, prayer is a means by which my heart connects with Krishna's heart. Prayer is a means by which my heart connects with Krishna's heart. And that is the essence of bhakti. And that we see here, Kunti in the last prayer that she offers. What is she asking for? Nothing. She concludes by simply offering obeisances. Sri Krishna, let's recite this verse. Sri Krishna Krishna Sakha Vrishna Rishabhavani Dhruga. Sri Krishna Krishna Sakha Vrishna Rishabhavani Dhruga. Rajanya Vamsha Dahanana Pavarga Virya. Rajanya Vamsha Dahanana Pavarga Virya. Govinda Godvij Surarati Haravatara. Govinda Godvij Surarati Haravatara. Yogeshwara Khila Guru Bhagavan Namaste. Yogeshwara Khila Guru Bhagavan Namaste. So, Bhagavan Namaste. Namaste, my dear Lord, I offer obeisances to you. So nothing is asked from the Lord, just obeisances are offered. And she offers a list of elaborate glories. See, Krishna, Krishna, Sakha. You are yourself all attractive Krishna. You are the Sakha of Krishna. Krishna is also the name of Draupadi and of Arjuna, because they are also dark complexion. Krishna Rishabha. You are the king of Rishni. Rishabhavani Dhruga. And of the earth there are many kings. Rajanya Vamsha Dahanan Apavarga Virya. You defeat all the impious kings of the earth. And then Apavarga Virya. You never get, your energy never goes down. Yogeshwar Apavarga Virya. Rajan Yogeshwar Govinda Godvij Surarati Haravatara. So you are Govinda. You are the protector of the cows, the Brahmanas, and the Devtas. And then she says, you are the Yogeshwara. The yogis are ultimately aiming for you. Akhila Guru. You are the spiritual master of the whole world. You are my spiritual master also. You know what is best for me. Therefore, I simply offer obeisances to you. Bhagavan Namaste. And the next verse will describe what is Krishna's response. Normally, if we pray to somebody, we expect yes, no. Now, Kunti does not ask only anything. So, there is no question of yes, no. But what is the response? Krishna smiles at her. And that is the perfection of a devotee. Now, devotee, whatever we do, it is for the pleasure of Krishna. Krishna smiles and accepts her heartfelt prayers. And that is the perfection of the devotion of Kunti Maharani. So, these are the prayers which Srila Prabhupada spoke on beautifully in Srila Prabhupada has not spoken on many prayers. He spoke on these prayers. And he showed us the importance of these prayers. So, we can also pray. Especially the last 3 prayers are very beautiful. Sneha Pashanam Chindi, Tvayi Me Ananya Vishaya, Bhagavan Namaste. These are prayers of pure devotion. And even if those emotions may be far away from us, just by repeating those prayers, those emotions will gradually start awakening in our heart. And when we offer these prayers, what happens is, if we offer our own prayer, that is also good. We are offering our heart, so emotions to Krishna. But repeating the prayers of the great Acharya, that also, or the great devotee, that has the advantage. That advantage is that we don't have much devotion. At least I don't have any devotion. So when I offer prayers, they won't please Krishna much. But when we offer the prayers of the great devotees, what happens is we remind Krishna of his devotees. And because Krishna loves his devotees, that remembrance of his devotees pleases Krishna. And because we have been the source of reminding Krishna of his devotees and their devotion, Krishna becomes pleased with us also. So even if Krishna is not pleased by our offering of prayers, still Krishna is pleased by our reminding of him of his devotees. And that way we get a second-hand benefit. So, somehow or other we can be benefited, we can please Krishna and we can be blessed by him. Shri Kunti Maharani ki, Shri Prabhupada ki, Grantraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Nitai Gaur Premanande. Thank you very much.